Today, I'm going to present to you the key findings from the Vancouver Rat Action Program, or VanRAP, which was a 4-year study we conducted on behalf of the City of Vancouver to explore barriers, opportunities, strengths, and weaknesses associated with municipal rat management, with a view to providing recommendations to cities seeking to improve their own or design their own rat management strategies. So this is part of the Vancouver Rat Project, which is a program of research active since 2010 to understand, monitor, and mitigate the diverse harms associated with rats. And finally, a note that our project is nested in the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative, which is Canada's national wildlife health network. And you'll see I've got Dr. Kaylee Byers and Dr. Mike Lee up here. And I also want to recognize, of course, Dr. Bobby Corrigan, who's been my mentor for 15 years now, Bobby. But I didn't put your name so you can disavow yourself of anything crazy that this Canadian is about to say. So for VanRAP, we collected and analyzed three sources of data, including a century of literature and documentation regarding municipal rat management. That gave us a lot of dry eye. The perceptions of municipal rat managers and stakeholders from 7 cities across the United States, and an analysis of rat management policy from those cities. Now, we are Canadians, and most of our, when I say we, Kaylee and I, most of our work has been focused on Canada, but we did actually focus on cities in the US for this program because municipal rat management in Canada is actually in its infancy. And we wanted to look at programs that had established. So subsequently, we used a process of data triangulation to explore themes that were common across these different data. Okay, so for the study of stakeholder perspectives, we conducted interviews and focus groups with individuals that held diverse roles and responsibilities in their city's rat management programs. So these included directors, pest management professionals, and public health personnel. And then we used a constructivist thematic framework. So we basically let our stakeholders determine what were the key themes that emerged. So what was the first theme? It was regarding the drivers of municipal rat management. So why do people think we're out there doing what we're doing? Now, interestingly, stakeholders felt that municipal governments were primarily concerned about disease risks associated with rats. How can you not, right? They loom large in our collective conscience as the source of pestilence. But it can be problematic because it can result in apathy in the absence of human clinical cases. The perspective is also problematic because as we've just discussed here, it doesn't account for the fact that rats are also a significant quality of life issue with impacts that extend far beyond physical health. Now, despite the impact of rats, stakeholders found or felt that they were a lower priority compared to other issues, both for residents and for governments, which they felt resulted in insufficient investment in municipal rat management. So, for example, one stakeholder said, the reality is rat management's not going to be the highest priority for us. Making sure that the roads are paved, making sure that people have their infrastructure they need to live their day-to-day life is always going to be a higher priority. With regard to the aim of municipal rat management, stakeholders felt that their focus was on reducing rat numbers, often with this aspirational goal of total eradication. We're going to go out across the city. We're going to win the war on rats. But they also admitted that eradication is probably not possible, even under ideal scenarios. And instead, they suggested it would be more efficient and effective to prioritize infestations in certain high-risk groups, such as those experiencing the greatest impact and least able to mitigate those harms. For example, one rodent in a classroom is a huge issue. Maybe in the park, though, it's not great, but more numbers can be tolerated. The next theme was tools and approaches for rat management. Stakeholders felt that effective rat management requires reducing resources available for rats, so food, water, and harborage, and that this is primarily the responsibility of private citizens. There's more of them out there than there are of us rat managers. But it's challenging to modify behavior without actually understanding what the public thinks about rats or what motivates them to conduct rat mitigation. So one stakeholder said, understanding what motivates people to do rat control is really important. Really important to understanding how you can get behavior change. Now, even though citizens do bear responsibility, they're the boots on the ground, stakeholders felt that municipalities need to play a leadership role in rat management. Now, that's maybe well accepted here in the US, not so much in Canada. They felt that enforcement tools such as bylaws were essential for success, but that rats should also be a consideration for other municipal departments whose activities could promote or deter rat infestations. Now, oh, that's sad. It was a lovely photo. Uh, so with regard to when and where to enact rat management, stakeholders felt that it's important to prioritize areas with persistent or severe problems. But the problem is we need data to drive those decisions. And there's often an absence of data to make these evidence-based choices. So one stakeholder said, we want to be able to say these parts of the city are important and we need to be doing work here. Interestingly, I think a lot of you will recognize this, there's a tension between the cost and quality of different approaches to data collection and intervention. For example, proactive in-person pest management inspections, great data, but super high cost. Whereas vice versa for reactive responses to rat complaints. So using rat complaints as your sole data source. So it really is you get what you pay for. But there is increased interest in these new technologies and approaches, such as sensor-based rat traps, and using municipal data sets like sanitation violations to help with or inform urban rat management. With regard to responsibilities and jurisdictions, who's responsible for what? Stakeholders felt that a dedicated program and or program manager should be the primary authority for municipal rat management to ensure sustainable, efficient, effective, consistent, and cohesive approach. So this is a great quote. Someone who has dedicated time to oversee the rat program so that the parks agency doesn't go out and start enforcement within a property and then public health goes out and is there the following week also doing enforcement. But they did feel that all departments, so although we should have some dedicated people involved, that all departments should consider the impacts of their activities on rat infestations. And interesting, there was mixed opinions about the involvement of private pest control professionals, with many expressing consternation at the fact that our governmental procurement processes focus on the lowest cost contractor, which doesn't always result in the highest quality deliverables. So now we get to the thick of it, determining success. So on the theme of determining success, stakeholders admitted that an overall lack of program evaluation meant that they couldn't demonstrate success or identify failure. And this is one of my favorite quotes because I feel this about my life as well. I'd like to think that I'm successful, but would love even more to have the data to prove it. And they felt the main barriers to evaluation within their programs were actually a lack of clear quantifiable goals. We don't actually totally know what we're here aiming for. So how do we know when we've been successful? As well as a lack of accurate and reliable data. So now I'm going to go on to discuss the results of the policy analysis. And this was interesting. I also work for the provincial government, so I do love policy. And I'm going to define policy here as the combination of documentation and action that outlines expectations and provides a basis for consistent decision-making and resource allocation in respect to a specific issue. I know that's a dry definition, but it's saying policy is more than just paper. Policy is how a group or a program can achieve a common goal. And in the context of municipal rat management, policy is actually determined by two things: the legislation or municipal code. So that sort of sets out your game board. It defines what people are allowed to do. And then the rat management programs themselves, which are the group of people and non-code documents that determines what's actually done in the context of the legislative framework. So they're the ones actually playing the game. In other words, policy is the papers and the programs or the people. So for the paper component, we read through all codes that included the term rats or rodents. And for the people component, we combined interviews from personnel, site visits, and reviews of non-code documents. However, this, I just mentioned a challenge, is that there was overall a lack of program evaluation. So how do you decide what's best practices? What's the benchmark we are trying to meet when we don't have that, that data empirically? So instead, what we did is looked at the content of the legislation and programming and compared it to established frameworks for policy development and analysis in order to identify theoretical best practices when it comes to rat management specifically. So in theory, what would that look like in an ideal state? We found that effective codes, so starting out with the legislation component, what are the actual codes? Effective codes would be rat specific and cross-jurisdictional. In other words, cities would have codes specifically focused on rat management rather than rats being a secondary focus in a series of unrelated codes used for other aspects of urban management, such as housing or sanitation. And that these codes should apply throughout the urban environment rather than only to certain property types or certain scenarios. It's also important for codes to have accessible enforcement capacity. And this accessibility has two axes, which is important. It can apply to the nature of the penalty. So, for example, fines are easier to administer than civil proceedings. It's having to take someone to court if there's a violation. You're less likely to have those codes actually be enforced just because it's hard to actually enforce them. Accessibility also applies to who has the authority to dole out penalties. So in our scenario, it's important that at a minimum, those responsible for administering a municipal rat problem, municipal rat problem program, actually have the legal authority to enforce the codes that they're responsible for. Not always the case. And finally, codes need to balance specificity and flexibility. And where on the spectrum a city decides to land is also going to depend on who is enforcing the codes. So no code can capture all possible scenarios that we meet in the real world. So a problem with codes that are overly specific is it can actually prevent people from addressing important rat related issues that they may encounter that fall outside the verbiage of the codes. And some codes are extremely specific. In contrast, codes that are too vague can be difficult for less experienced staff to administer and can result in the inconsistent application even amongst experienced staff. So there's a balance to be struck there. Now let's move on to the people side, the program side. So in theory, an effective municipal rat management program would include a dedicated group or individual. So here we're seeing some common themes, responsible for overseeing rat management with the authority to act across the urban landscape. And the program would balance proactive and reactive components, as well as legislation, so codes and penalties, education, and action. So these programs actually going into the community and doing rat mitigation themselves. An effective program also needs clear, actionable objectives linked to definitions of success. the collection of diverse data to inform action and measure success, and a built-in process of evaluation and evolution. So even if we're successful now, that may change in the future and we'll have to adapt. So for the final line of inquiry, we collated all of the published and gray English language literature regarding municipal rat management for 100 years, a century. That was a lot of reading. And we wanted to answer two questions. What are the purported best practices for municipal rat management from the experts over time? And have those practices led to success? Are we winning the war on rats? So we found that the overarching paradigm for municipal rat management since at least the 1900s has been to reduce or eliminate rats across the urban landscape. So throughout cities, that is really the true north. We need to get rid of rats wherever and whenever they exist. And that this needs to be done through widespread integrated pest management and or extermination, often through rodenticides. And that experts feel that we need to be applying these methods across the urban landscape on a comprehensive, regular, and ongoing basis. So far, so good. I think we can agree with that. But here's the problem. Unfortunately, the majority of the programs documented in the literature did not evaluate success, and those that did were not successful. So in 2005, Easterbrook found that the estimated size of the rat population in Baltimore remained unchanged since the mid-1900s, despite ongoing rodent management and a decrease in human population density in that city. And municipal rat management failures were blamed on a combination of methodological flaws and bureaucratic barriers. So for example, a reliance on rodenticides without addressing the resources available to rats, a lack of authority to address infestations when and where it was needed, an inconsistent investment and interest on the part of municipal decision makers. So where did that leave us? We got a lot of data, and after triangulating these different sources, we have several overarching themes. This is where it's going to get a little heated. Don't worry. So the most significant of these themes is that similar to the wars we have waged on alcohol and drugs, we are in a war on rats. And while this approach is totally understandable, makes sense, it's not working. And I think it's not working for two reasons. The first is, I have a funny sidebar because I was in the East Village and I had a shopkeeper tell me rats in New York are having a moment right now. I am riding on the coattails of these rats that are having a moment. But as opposed to this moment that we are in, I think we can agree that unfortunately the war on rats is just not a priority for our governments or their citizens. And for that reasons, the resources allocated to urban rat management have been limited, inconsistent, and never sufficient to actually finance a successful war as we originally envisioned it. Second, the war on rats doesn't account for the complexity of the rat problem. Our current approach to municipal rat management can be reductionist in nature based on the idea that many infestations can be solved by applying IPM many times. But management devised with this focus is often stymied by barriers that are beyond the scope of pest management science, politics, legislation, human behavior. So one way to break out of our war on rats paradigm, I think, is to reconceptualize municipal rat management as a wicked problem. So one that results from multiple, complex, contingent, and interconnected issues. And we had that video, why controlling rats is harder than rocket science. And I used to say that, why can we take a picture of a black hole, but we can't manage rats? But those are actually tame problems. We have a harder agenda in front of us today than taking a picture of a black hole or putting a man on the moon. But we will not be deterred. Sorry about that. So why is wicked problem theory helpful other than just kind of changing the way we look at the problem? And I think it's because it helps us to realize that the rat problem actually can't be solved or won. It can only be managed. And although all of our cities would love the manual, right? Here is how you deal with rats. The end. The problem is there's no single definition of the problem. And the problem is going to be unique in every city and even in different cities within a neighborhood. And that program is going to change, or that problem is going to change over time. And as with other wicked problems, there is no single solution or even a finite set of possible solutions. And we can have two approaches when we learn about this complexity. We can throw all these papers in the air. Oh man, what are we doing here? And it may seem scary, but it actually opens the door for new tools and approaches that we maybe haven't considered or focused on yet. I'm going to end my talk with a couple of these. So, for example, we focused a lot on integrated pest management. We're really good at it, but not the overall framework in which it should be implemented. So, going forward, a focus on the development of good public policy when it comes to municipal rat management can help us prioritize things like comprehensiveness, consistency, viability. Is what we're proposing actually viable in the long term? Cost benefit ratios. How much are we spending compared to how much benefit we're actually getting to the taxpayers? Goals and definitions of success, evaluation, and evolution. It can also help us to reconceptualize rats as part of a complex system. This was a chapter from a textbook that I wrote, and I made this diagram to symbolize that rats are part of a complex system that includes intertwined social, economic, infrastructural, environmental, and governmental networks. And again, that might seem overwhelming, but it actually starting to think about the connections between rats and the other parts of the system helps us to better understand the true root causes and impacts of rat infestation and to identify new and diverse leverage points. So, what are some new areas that we can actually intervene to make a difference? And then to predict ahead of time what could be the barriers or the consequences of our actions. I also like systems thinking. Wow, I got super excited and just talked without putting any of my slides up, but I'm on track now. Sorry, guys. Uh, so in a system, the relationships between the components are more numerous and more important than the components in and of themselves. So rather than focusing on getting rid of rats, identifying, understanding, and modifying these relationships or interfaces in our rat systems can lead to more effective and impactful and even sustainable solutions. So I'll give you an example. The interface between rats and people is going to change depending on the setting. We know that, right? Whether you encounter a rat at work, in the park, at home. And really, as Mayor Adams noted, the home environment is the place where the relationship between rats and people is least tenable. But especially in Canada, private residences are often the areas most ignored by municipal powers. Like, right, the government has no place in the houses of our nations. However, a focus on interfaces would show us that they are an area of particular vulnerability and should be prioritized for municipal intervention and assistance. And since factors associated with urban poverty promote infestations and rat human conflict, impoverished inner city areas also deserve special attention. A focus on interfaces can also help us understand, and Kaylee was alluding to this, that really actually our true goal it is not to get rid of the rats. It's to decrease the harm that rats are causing or the harm that's occurring at these interfaces. And just as harm reduction provided an alternative approach to the war on drugs, it may help us to end our war on rats. So the goal of harm reduction is to reduce the negative impact of drugs or rats, rather than solely focusing on getting rid of the drugs or rats themselves. And it's helpful because it can allow us to make gains even when we can't get rid of the rats themselves. So this is the area that Kaylee and I study a lot, the tenements of the Vancouver's downtown east side. And as she mentioned, we found that the infestations so prominent in these single room occupancy hotels were problematic because they symbolized social injustice and neglect, as well as feelings of powerlessness when it came to really the deplorable situations in which people are being forced to live. So, in this scenario, rather than just going into these buildings and getting rid of rats, expanding municipal bylaws that enshrine the renter's rights to a healthy living environment would be more efficient and effective. Could make a big difference and not even touch, not even think about a rat in this scenario. Now, interestingly, we did find also in Vancouver that a major risk factor for rat exposure was engaging in outdoor injection drug use. And interestingly, the supervised injection sites, which were actually developed for harm reduction, reducing the harm associated with drugs, also helped to reduce rat exposure and the harms associated with that exposure. I'm almost done, but I want to take this concept of harm reduction one step further. Okay. And then you get resilience. So these are solutions that have multiple benefits and that enable a system to better weather future disturbances. So have multiple benefits in the here and now and also allow us to be better prepared for the future. So the bylaw example I provided, although I use it as an example of harm reduction, it really is a resilience-based solution because we know that a healthy living environment is key to addressing and preventing a broad range of physical, mental, social issues. So just fixing that one element can have multiple benefits. And resilience theory is really helpful, especially when resources are tight, because it gives taxpayers and decision makers more bang for their buck. Okay, I'm going to have this one solution and it is going to have multiple benefits. And it's uh, particularly beneficial when we can allow those solutions to align with other municipal priorities, right? We've already said rats are not on the top agenda item for council meetings. But what if we can have solutions that meet a series of priorities and have the benefit of addressing rats? So Vancouver has the greenest city policy. Greenest city, was it 2020, Kaylee? I don't remember. Want to be the greenest city in the world. And they had a huge focus on two things, efficient buildings and waste reduction. Now, given that many of the characteristics that make a building more energy efficient also make it impervious to rodents, granting programs or other programs that facilitate building renovations align with both the Greenest City Initiative and our rat management goals, as well as creating a more healthy home that's less expensive to heat and cool going into a future of extreme temperatures and high energy costs. And Vancouver also prioritizes local food production, including urban orchards. But these trees produce more fruit than residents can consume, leading to fallen fruit, which of course feeds the rats. So a resilience-based solution would be enlisting the help of the Vancouver Tree Fruit Project, which has a mission to leave no fruit unpicked. And this group can remove fruit waste as well as contribute to food security by delivering excess food to local food banks. But interventions based on these approaches, while they may sound attractive, are only going to be as good as the evidence says they are, which brings us to the importance of systematic data collection, needed for four critical purposes. First, we need to identify and quantify the issue we're trying to address so we can set goals and justify municipal investments. Why should council give us this money? We also need it to prioritize areas for intervention so that we can efficiently and effectively allocate resources. We need it to understand local risk factors for rat infestations and rat-related harm so that we can develop tailored solutions. And finally, something that I think we have the furthest to go on, we need to measure the outcome of interventions and to perform cost benefit analyses so that we can evaluate our programs, evolve them if necessary, and rationalize the decisions we're going to make. So Leah may recognize this map. Does it look familiar? It's the city of Seattle. And this was an example where we worked to use data from the sewer baiting system to identify areas with high risks of rat infestations, indicated in red, as well as the characteristics of sewer system construction that could promote or deter rat infestation. So that can help with decisions about sewer repair. So last slide, I've just spoken about using data to justify investments in municipal rat management, but what is actually the most important thing to be investing in? And I alluded to the fact that I think both cities would love us to give a manual and walk away. But given the complexity of the rat problem and the fact that it's something we will have to manage in the long term, as long as we choose to live in cities, and the fact that it varies over time and space, and the fact that any tool or approach is only going to be as good as the people we have to develop, implement, and oversee it. For this reason, the single most important investment in any municipal rat management, if there's one thing we learned from this 4-year odyssey, it will be the people that we put at the helm. Thank you.